This man was so unpredictable that anybody could have been his next victim. Oh, hi there, stranger. This is part 45 of the Britain's Whole Lifer series, so viewer discretion is advised. So today I'm going to be telling you about Royston Jackson, who was born in 1967 and grew up in Essex. Nothing on his childhood, but I can tell you that by April 1989, around age 22, he was working at a curtain factory in Dagenham in Essex. And Jackson was known for having a bit of a violent temper and threatening people. And he was a bit of a bully. He bullied one of his co-workers, a 16-year-old boy by the name of Stephen Raven. And Stephen was one of the people that Jackson had threatened. He'd actually threatened to unalive Stephen. And then in that April of 1989, 16-year-old Stephen would attend a local gig, and so would Jackson. Stephen would leave and Jackson would follow shortly after. Stephen Raven was never seen alive again. Stephen's body was found in a remote countryside area with horrific injuries. His neck had been manually compressed, he had been repeatedly struck in the head with a blunt object, and then he had been run over with a car. He had then been left to pass away in that secluded area. When he was found, Stephen was clothed, but investigators knew that his clothing had been interfered with because his underwear was inside out and back to front. Once police identified Jackson as a suspect, they would seize his car, as of course a car had been one of the weapons used in the unaliving of Stephen, but they would recover no physical evidence, no trace of red bodily fluid, and in fact the car was so spotlessly clean that they only recovered one fingerprint from the entire vehicle. This led one officer to believe that Jackson was, quote, forensically aware. Side note, strangers, but due to Locard's exchange principle, which basically says that every contact leaves a trace, I personally didn't think it would be possible to clean a car so well that police would be unable to recover any physical evidence. Of course, I know nothing, and this was 1989. However, one thing that had remained forensically was the tyre tread pattern that had been left behind on Stephen's jeans when he had been run over, and that tyre tread did match the tyre tread on Jackson's car perfectly. And so Royston Jackson was arrested for the unaliving of Stephen Raven. He was tried and found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He served 16 years and was released in 2006 on life licence. Upon his release, he lived in a bail hostel where he met an elderly guy by the name of Gordon Boone. The pair became friends and lived in the hostel together for around a year. They both eventually moved into separate rented accommodation but did remain friends. And then in early October 2008, 73-year-old Gordon Boone was reported missing by his family. He had missed a pre-arranged drink with his son and wasn't answering his phone. Police went to Gordon's flat and broke down the door, and there was no sign of Gordon, but there were small signs that something was off. There was yesterday's paper on the coffee table when Gordon went every morning to get one. Also, his bag that he always carried was sitting beside his chair. Just small things, but enough to raise suspicion. And then a body was discovered in a remote area of Norfolk on the 6th of October, and fingerprints determined it to be Gordon Boone, and his family was notified. Now, police did have to go to work on this one. As I'd mentioned, Gordon Boone had been to prison. He'd met Royston Jackson in a bail hostel. Gordon Boone had been to prison for essaying his daughter from the age of 8 throughout most of her childhood. For that unspeakable crime, Gordon was sentenced to 6 years and served 4. So naturally, the police concluded that the perpetrator could be any number of people. Still, they treated this like any other inquiry and got to work. And fair play to them, they've got a job to do, and I've no doubt that it would have been hard for some of them to stomach knowing what Gordon had done. There must be so many hidden difficulties within policing that us civilians could just never really understand. The police investigation led them to Jackson. There were similarities between the unalivings of Stephen Raven and Gordon Boone. Both men had had their necks manually compressed. Both had had their clothing interfered with, and they'd been found in very similar locations. Once police made contact with Jackson, he instantly started flip-flopping, saying he hadn't seen Gordon for 2 to 3 weeks, and then changing that to saying he hadn't seen Gordon for at least 4 weeks. He also wanted to immediately explain that he had scratches on his arm from his job as a turkey catcher. Yes, that is a thing. So police are like, okay, ex-unaliver, this all seems to square up. On your way. No, of course not. They are side-eyeing this guy bombastically. They investigate Jackson further, and telephone records show that on the day of Gordon's likely unaliving, the two had indeed been in contact. And then they found CCTV footage of what they deemed to be Jackson's car driving into and then out of Norwich city centre. They also found CCTV footage of Jackson going into a petrol station around 1 a.m. that same night, and then again at around 5 a.m. the next morning. Police believe that that is when Jackson was disposing of Gordon's remains. They decided to arrest Jackson, but he had fled, only to hand himself in on the 14th of October. In his interview, he was absolutely confident that there would be no physical evidence linking him to Gordon's unaliving. So maybe he really did clean that car back in '89. He admitted that he'd seen Gordon on the evening of the 3rd of October, but said he'd only gone round there to return a borrowed DVD. He said he'd gone back home from there, got into bed, where he stayed all night sleeping. Obviously, the police knew he was lying because of the petrol station footage. And then to make matters even worse, they ran Jackson's DNA through the database, and it uncovered another of his horrific crimes. This crime had occurred back in the late 80s, and it had been the R of a female. She had also had her neck manually compressed. So a very similar MO, but a very different victim. She did survive that attack, but it just goes to show that Jackson really could have gone for anybody. Jackson was never charged with that offence, but it is believed that he probably had more victims. Now, even though Jackson had handed himself in on the 14th of October, he had initially fled back to Essex, and this broke the terms of his probation, and so they were able to recall him to prison, allowing police to continue their investigation. And nearly 2 decades after the first time they had done so, the police again seized Jackson's car. And he'd done a good job back in '89, but this time forensic teams took Jackson's car apart and searched it with fine-tooth combs. And bingo, baby. Lockhardt's principle comes true and comes through, because they find trace elements of red bodily fluid that could have been matched to Gordon Boone. They also matched fibres that were recovered from Gordon's underwear to fibres that belonged to Jackson's car. And just as a nice little extra, some of Gordon's bank cards and loyalty cards were found discarded at a park some 500 yards away from Jackson's address. The case was really starting to solidify against him, but he maintained his innocence, and so it went to trial. The trial lasted a few weeks, and as I'm sure you can imagine, the evidence against him was pretty damning. And so Royston Jackson was found guilty and sentenced to a whole life order in March 2010. He served 9 years of that and then passed away on the 10th of March 2019. Oh, exactly 6 years ago today. Ugh. Rest in peace to Stephen Raven. And I hope that the lady that was R''d by Jackson in the late 80s went on to have a very happy life. The thought of an unknown number of victims is very scary. And that is part 45. I found this one to be particularly disturbing just because of the range of victims that this guy had. It's quite remarkable and just really terrifying because it could have been anyone. As ever, please let me know what you think in the comments. And of course, if you've stayed with me up until now, then thank you for watching, and I will see you for the next one.